All right, guys, welcome back to the Davis Fitness Method podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Davis, and today I have Stu Locke with me. Stu Locke is an incredibly intelligent individual as well as a super strong one, and I figured who better than Stu to have on and talk strength. Stu, for those who don't know who you are, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, maybe some of your background?
So my name's Stuart Locke. I'm Canadian by birth. I was born in Toronto, grew up in the United States. I am the head coach and managing partner of Kodiak Barbell. So we coach powerlifters, all kinds of sports athletes, and also do nutrition. What got me into lifting weights was I was a two-sport collegiate athlete. So I played both football and rugby in university. And then that's what kind of led me down the rabbit hole that is powerlifting. And I've been coaching powerlifting, at least in some capacity, since 2015. So right around 8 years. And it has become my life's magnificent obsession. I think about it most of the day. I spend a lot of my day researching it. I spend a lot of my day consuming content around it. And I love it more than anything else. And it has given me an incredible life and something I'm very grateful for.
How do you think you kind of ended up falling in love with, powerlifting?
So I think it honestly came about just as a byproduct of playing sports for such a long time. So the wonderful thing about sports is you have a set of rules. You have a very objective outcome of you either scored points or didn't score points, and the other team either scored more points than you or less points than you. And if you scored more points, you win. If you score less points, you lose. And there's this degree of indifference about it that I really appreciated, where it's it doesn't matter how much you shared, it doesn't matter how so you controlled. If the other team wins and you lose, it doesn't matter because you caring more about it or you thinking that you tried your best. It doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things if you failed. So I found powerlifting was the closest analog that I could find when it came to kind of barbell sports, right? So when you think about Olympic lifting, it's not so much absolute strength, it's a lot more technique, and a lot of guys are limited just based on technique. It's not necessarily the strongest that win in Olympic lifting meets. It's the most technically skilled who can then display the strength they have. And then strongman, you have a huge variety of events, revolving events, and you can have the strongest guy in the world or the world's strongest man, and if he's getting a bunch of events that he's not naturally good at, he's not going to win. And CrossFit's obviously just being fit. And then I was like, okay, the only thing left that's truly objective that I have is probably powerlifting, because it's very basic rules, and it's, did you lift this weight or did you not lift this weight? Did you squat to depth and stand up with it? Yes or no? Did you pause the bar on your chest when you bench and press it back to lockout? Yes or no? Did you hold the bar out lockout when you deadlift it? Yes or no? And that objectivity I found is pretty closely mimicked the kind of indifference or callousness of sport. And that's what really attracted me to it, because I was like, it doesn't matter how bad you want it. It matters, how hard you've worked for it and how much effort you've put in. And then the beauty of it is because it's an individual sport, it's not a team sport, you don't have to worry about other people letting you down.
Are there certain base, foundational principles that you kind of check boxes with for clients when they first come on? How do you ensure that person is going to be successful in the long run while they're working with you?
So it actually first comes down to kind of the psychology of the athlete and the psychology of the lifter. So I've gotten much more comprehensive with my intake process as time has gone on. And in fact, the intake process that we have now currently at Kodiak, which is with me and all of the other coaches, is a 2-part intake. So Jem, who's my wife, does their actual kind of injury history assessment, all that kind of stuff. And she's the one who starts to first vet them out and see where they're at from kind of a psychological perspective as well. And so she's the person that gives us their entire injury history, exercises that are contraindicated to, stuff like that. But she's the person that'll tell us hey, this person's a little bit more neurotic. This person's likely going to have a hard time with adversity in training, et cetera, et cetera. So, essentially I have a couple of preconditions for someone to be able to work with me. One, they have to be especially with new people coming on, is they can't be super high on neuroticism, right? So neuroticism is like one of the big 5 personality traits is essentially like how strongly you will have a negative response to an external event, right? So let's say you're walking to work and you trip and you spill your coffee. A non-neurotic person would be like, well, that sucks. I'll just mix pre-workout when I get to work, right? A neurotic person would let it ruin their day. They would go down the rabbit hole. And I'm sure you've had plenty of personal training clients like that as well. And so, in order to be successful in powerlifting, especially in the long term, you have to be pretty low in trait neuroticism. And oftentimes we get people who are very skilled lifters and come to us and they're high in trait neuroticism. And it's about putting, systems in place to help decrease that neuroticism. But that's the first thing is like, they can't be super neurotic. And then after that, like they have to have a baseline level of competency. And I also like, just based on the cohort of clients that I have now, I don't really attract more beginner lifters or beginner athletes. We do have a place for that within the company. And in fact, a fellow Seattle resident, Kyle McKee's the guy that does that, right? So Kyle's the one that handles our more beginner lifters. And he's the guy that handles, the newer people. And then they're essentially in the Kodiak pipeline. And then based on where they get to as a lifter, they can be shuffled around between the coaches based on their need. But the baseline level of competency is like, can you perform some kind of squat, some kind of bench, some kind of deadlift, and then we can progress based off that. But it's not like you need to squat 500 pounds in order to work with us or anything. It's literally just, can you kind of make it look like this, and then we can figure out the rest. And then you just can't be super neurotic.
What so I know with all these, and you have full-blown courses on each one of these lifts, but are there things that people could focus on? Are there main things where people fail inside of these lifts, like squat, bench, and dead, where if they prioritize some of their time and energy, they would see more benefits than, I don't know, like typical accessories? Because like a lot of people, like, they think they're going to improve their lockout on their bench by putting a block on their chest, or, various things like that. Where do you think most people fail? Is there a place where most people fail? Is it kind of all over the board?
Yeah. So I think from an overarching perspective, I think the easiest way to express how most people fail is a lack of repeatability, right? So it's, we can go down the rabbit hole of like, this person fails here and this person fails here and et cetera. But at its core, powerlifting is 3 singles of squat, 3 singles of bench, 3 singles of deadlift. And if you want to have a high degree of success in the sport, your first, your second, your third attempt, all of those lifts should look reasonably similar. And, if there's one piece of advice I could give any person that's getting into kind of powerlifting for the first time, is that if you're doing a set of 5, rep 1 needs to look like rep 2, needs to look like rep 3, needs to look like rep 4, needs to look like rep 5. And you need to figure out what you have to change in your technique and what you have to do differently to increase that degree of repeatability rep to rep. But the lack of repeatability time and time again is what I see kicks people in the ass. And the easiest way to increase that repeatability is through increased frequency, right? So, if you're doing, let's say, 1 squat a week, 1 deadlift a week, and then 2 presses a week, the chances of you having a relatively refined squat pattern is probably going to be low, right? It's going to be a full calendar week before you're back to that day again. It's going to be a full calendar week before you're back to squatting. So the chances of it being a nice one are pretty low. If you were to squat 2-3 days a week, and it doesn't necessarily have to be with a barbell, right? You don't necessarily have to put a bar on your back. You can do high bar one day, you can do goblet squat the next day, and you could do a hack squat on the third day. But just like getting consistent exposure to those patterns on a more consistent basis is going to increase our body's awareness of how those movements work and our body's ability to put itself in the right positions in space. And the same thing goes for the bench, and the same thing goes for the deadlift, right? Most people, most of the time, how I used to train all of my general population clients is they did some kind of squat 3 days a week. They did some kind of hinge 3 days a week. And they did some kind of pressing 3 days a week. And that would differ, and it would change over the course of the week, and it would change over program to program, but giving them that consistently high exposure to that and this consistently high frequency allowed them to refine that pattern a lot more quickly, because it's going to be 2 days or maybe a day before you're back doing it again. So it's more fresh in your mind. And I think frequency is a very misunderstood concept. And I think for us, like, I'm sure you were much the same. As like a lot of the first programs that I read were on bodybuilding.com, and you're like, fuck, I'm gonna have chest day and my back day and then my leg day and then my arm day, and then I have to take 2 days off, and then I have to repeat that cycle again. It's like, okay. So a lot of these kind of foundational tenets for understandings of how people think programs should be is based on like incorrect first principles, or like faulty information that is setting kind of our ideas surrounding it all. And so what I would say is like frequency is going to be the best thing. Increasing repeatability is going to be the best thing. And if most people, like, I'm pretty confident in saying, like, if you had a guy that came to you, total general population guy, never trained before, if you gave them a high frequency model where they're doing those things 3 days a week when they're seeing you in person, within 6 months, they would have developed a high enough degree of repeatability that you could put a bar on their back, you could put a bar in their hands, and you could get them to deadlift, and they would be fine.
So each one of those patterns 3 days a week?
Yeah. And again, you always want to be conscious of the fact that we wouldn't want to be going heavy 3 days a week with each one, but like, just like I gave you the example of like what I used to do with a lot of my general population clients is like day one, they would do SSB squat to a box, right? So it's pretty easy. Then they would do like machine flat press, and then they would do like a kettlebell deadlift. And then day two, they would do like goblet squats, dumbbell flat bench, and, maybe an actual dumbbell RDO. And then day three, they might go and do hack squat, or like a goblet box squat. And then they would do, maybe like a Smith machine flat press. And then they would do like trap bar deadlift or trap bar stiff leg, right? And essentially all you would do is like the more accessory type of those exercises, right? So like if you're doing a goblet squat, you're probably going to be doing sets of 10 to 12, or a little bit more reps, a little bit more hypertrophy. And then the heavier, more easily loadable stuff like the trap bar or the SSB or whatever, you're going to probably have those in the lower rep range. And then so what naturally kind of occurs over the course of the week is you have a combination of higher rep range stuff and lower rep range stuff. You have a combination of heavier and lighter stuff. And so it's not that they're having like a really hard time recovering from it, because in actuality, like each session is probably stressing them in a slightly different way. And the big thing too is, especially with newer people, their ability to recruit enough muscle to cause fatigue is actually pretty low. And that's the thing that a lot of people forget, right? Is like fatigue is not really something that we should take into account with like newer trainees or general population trainees, because they don't know how to motor coordinate well enough to cause fatigue in the first place.
At what point would you begin to worry about fatigue? Like, is there a certain amount of weight somebody's lifting where you're like, okay, now like maybe you shouldn't be deadlifting 3 days a week?
Yeah. I mean, I think what it comes down to too is where you start, where you're going to end up. And what I mean by that is like, if you have someone who from the outset has been exposed to like 2 to 3 hinges a week, that's where their base has been built from the start. And when we start to worry about fatigue is more so like when we start to track subjective markers of fatigue, right? Like, how are you sleeping? How is your soreness in each muscle? How is your motivation to train? How is your sex drive? How is your appetite? Because you have trained general population people in person for quite some time, those are the questions that you ask when they're warming up, right? Like, how'd you sleep last night? How was stress at work today? Like all the little questions, because you're starting to calibrate and figure out where they're at in the session. And in actuality, like, dude, with general population clients that like squat less than 2 plates, bench like less than a plate, deadlift like 2 plates, I don't know, I deload them like every 6 to 8 weeks maybe. And the deload would just be like switching to a different style of programming. And they're going to be bad at it for the first 2 or 3 weeks. So they're not still going to have a decrease in weight. But I think the the idea of fatigue just in general is really it's really, really overstated, and its effects are really, really overstated in an acute sense, and are really overstated in kind of like a chronic long-term sense. And so, good example, right? Let's say we put together a really good training week for Stephen, and we figured out, a great collection of exercises that are going to get you stronger on a week-to-week basis. And every week you can come in and you can add 5 to 15 pounds on those exercises. Let's say at the end of the block, at the end of 4 weeks or at the end of 5 weeks, you are up 30 or 40 pounds on all of those exercises. And you've set a PR in that final week. That also shows that even under a high degree of fatigue, because at the end of a block, fatigue is supposed to be the highest, even under a high degree of fatigue, we were able to perform well and we were able to hit a PR. So it's likely that this idea or concept of fatigue has really been played out or overplayed by people. In actuality, like most people, most of the time can train with small modifications for an extended period of time without needing to take a break. And if we are trying to build people with resilience, or we're trying to build people who can handle a sufficient amount of work, treating them like they're broken and that they need to take time to rest every 3 to 5 weeks is a bad way to do it.
Yeah, I've heard Shallow mention like there's like a 30% window where it's like you don't want to go like 15% below or like 15% above too quickly or for an extended period of time, because you'll either detrain them or B, like potentially like overwork them too quickly. Yeah. So kind of staying in like that range, right? Like there's some, I guess thought process where some people believe where, oh, you need to take time off from actual like pure strength work and move more towards like volumes. Is that true?
I would say that if you think that it's true, it's true. Okay. So, I mean, like the big thing that I think a lot of people forget when it comes to training in general is that like the psychology matters a ton, and the psychology matters, I think, a lot more than people want to give it credit for. And it's like, if you think something's going to work, then it's going to work, right? Like the placebo effect has a greater statistical significance than pretty much anything else, right? Is like, I always love to tell people the story of like in the 70s, they had a bunch of college-age males and they told them that they were taking steroids, and they progressed the same as people that were actually being given steroids, right? So like the athlete's belief in a system is going to account for a lot more than pretty much anything else. But yeah, like it's, I don't know. I think with a lot of this stuff, it is, herein lies the rub, right? Is we read these training texts, right? Or like translated Russian stuff, right? And when they talk about these kind of concepts of fatigue, right? And it's like you read science, you practice the sport training, right? And the big thing that they refer to in science and practice of sport training is in a lot of things that have unbelievably high volumes, right? So you look at someone who's doing, the Russians used to do 13 training sessions a week for Olympic lifting. Bulgarians used to do 13 training sessions a week for Olympic lifting. And then you look at people who train decathlon, like those people are having like 10 to 14 sessions a week, right? So it's like when we're talking about modifying intensity, all those sorts of things, this more applicable to stuff that's really, really high intensity like that on a very consistent basis over a very long time than it is to something like powerlifting, where people are going to be training for 10 hours a week, 12 hours a week, maybe, right? And it's just like, I think a better way to look at it is just like, if we could design training in such a way that it eliminated the need for a consistent deload, what would training look like? Right? Because you said that you gave that 30% rule that Shallow talked about. You don't want to go too light because then you'll detrain. You don't want to go too heavy because then you'll cause undue fatigue, right? So we can also just use that as kind of like a guiding precept or an idea regarding training in general, which is like most training should be in that kind of like 65 to 80% range, in that kind of RPE 7 to RPE 8 range, where it's like it's meaningfully difficult but it's not so much that you're smoked leaving the gym, right? Like the average lifter should leave being like, you know what, like that was a hard session, but I feel pretty good. I can like go home and I can eat and relax and I can train again tomorrow like that. That's probably going to lead to better long-term results than trying to apply and then misapply these kind of like esoteric or difficult to understand concepts from Russian sport training literature that might not even be translated properly.
Fair. So so for somebody who's like, okay, well, they hear this, okay, 30% up, down, whatever. And let's say you maybe for a period of time they're not maybe doing like their sumo dead off the floor, but maybe they're doing like a block pull, or maybe they're doing like a deficit pull. How do they know, okay, like with the block pull, I should be doing X amount more, or with the deficit, maybe with a pause, like I should be doing this much less? Are they just judging it off of RPE?
Yeah. So I think, when we go, because there's a couple of things, right? Is when we try to mark like, and this was like a Paul, right? Where he was like, you got to be able to front squat 80% of your back squat. So you would just like throw a random numbers. If, good example, right? So the most I've pulled sumo is 355 kilos, so 782 pounds. I also broke my back in 2018, and the most I've ever stiff legged was like maybe 500 for 5. But that's like, what, 60% or 62%? So someone looks at me as a trainee without having any of that underlying knowledge, you're going to be like, that dude's super shit at stiff legs. If we got his stiff legs better, sumo would go, right? But it's like, okay, but what they don't see just based on the number and the amount of reps is that my RPE for that, or my level of strain, or my level of relative intensity is very high. So when we're looking at these exercises, one, the longer you do an exercise, the better you're going to get at it, and the higher percentage of your actually going to be able to do. But two, when you have exercises that are like quite dissimilar from the competition pattern, we need to use markers of relative intensity, not absolute intensity, right? So when we think about those two concepts, relative intensity is how hard was this on a scale of 5 to 10? 5 is like, that's pretty easy. That's a warm up. 6 is like starting to be kind of hard. 7 is like, that's probably actually a working set. 8 is like, I can probably get 2 reps now. 9 is like, I could have done 1 more rep. And 10 is like, gun to my head, I'm not going to be able to do another rep, right? Like that's what RP is. And most of our training should be in that RP 7, RP 8 range, sometimes as high as RP 9, sometimes as low as RP 6. But if we're using percentages based on the person, they're going to fail to accurately determine how hard the person needs to push. Because I'm sure you run percentage-based programs before, and it's like this weird, shitty balance where like for the first 2 or 3 weeks, it's not hard enough. And then it gets way too hard really quickly. And you're like, this seems like it's inefficient. Like this seems like a fuck up.
I actually suffered my first back injury, like trying to get into a powerlifting program where I was like running these percentages that like jumped up. It wasn't like the first couple of weeks, but it was like as I was going through, and then all of a sudden I didn't like actually I don't think I actually did anything to my back, but I woke up one day and I was like, like my whole shit was seized up, and like I'd had nerve pain to the bottom of my feet, but it wasn't like, I don't think I tore anything, but it was just like, yeah, my body was like, no more of that.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? So when we think about the idea of like fatigue or workload or managing those sorts of things, that for you, like what you just described is like kind of the basic tenets of like what would be a disc injury, right? So you have like radiculopathy, which is like you have nerve pain down into the feet, or like nerve pain away from the site of injury, which is in your back. And so that typically happens because like these structures that are in soft tissue in our body, right? So like you have muscles, and that's soft tissue. And then you also have shit like ligaments and tendons and discs and bone. Those recover at different rates, right? And so a muscle is going to recover much more quickly than a ligament or a tendon. And a disc is going to have a finite amount of ability or load placed through it before we start to have issues. And obviously like trunk stability is going to be able to effectively buffer that force into, let's say, your legs as opposed to your low back. That typically is indicative of like, this person likely started with too much volume. And, what we know kind of about discs over time, is that their kind of disc issues are worse in the morning. Just based on the anatomy of how a disc works. And so it was likely that you over a consistent period of time, probably 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, we surpassed our ability to recover. And because the program wasn't tailored to us, we surpassed our ability to recover because it wasn't taking into account our individual markers of fatigue. And then we ended up with this weird kind of disky thing that took us out of commission. But when we think about the basics of prescriptive exercise, we have to develop, that golden plan for Stephen Davis. That's not going to be, this sets and percentages of reps. That's like, and it's always like the names of the programs are always insane. It's like fucking Bulgarian death method and just like ridiculous shit. And you're like, you fucking hurt your back. Are you surprised?
Yeah.
And, but yeah, like, it's just, with stuff like that. And it's like, from a chronic perspective, you were likely fatigued and you likely started to, in week 6, 7, 8, whatever, started to have higher percentage of reps that were a low degree of repeatability. We started to stress structures in our body that we shouldn't. We started to dump load out of things like our muscles and into things like our structure, like our ligaments and our tendons and our discs. And then that was the result.
Yeah.
And so
I think the main thing was like, I had muscles that like had not gone through the higher percentage effort, like lifts. So like I basically never done that. I probably never really went above, I would imagine 80%. Like I wasn't 1RMing ever. So it was like literally just like bodybuilding style training. And even if I did something that was like in a 3 or something, it would be like for like high velocity or like jumps or stuff like that. So it was more of that stuff. And then when I started doing strength stuff, it felt like I was like, oh, I'm getting strong fast. But it was like, I had never done that stuff. So I was just like, I'm certain I overloaded too quickly now, just kind of looking back on it.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I wanted to ask you, like you're talking about repeatability, we're also talking about RPE. If somebody's performing the exercise with a low degree of repeatability, but they're rating it at like an RPE 7 or an RPE 8, is it truly an RPE 8 or 7? If like, for example, if somebody's like bench pressing, but every time maybe they get their hands too low and their shoulders kind of pop up, internally rotate their shoulders and they kind of dump it back.
Mm-hmm.
Does that count as an RPE 7? Would you?
Yeah. And so we have to be able to differentiate between two things, right? So like I always tell people RPE is like, it is reps relative to failure. But it's also like, let's say you're playing football and you get an end around and you get hit by the linebacker and then you get hit by the defensive end and then you like fall into the end zone and score a touchdown. It was super ugly and it wasn't great, but you scored a touchdown. The objective measure at the end is that you scored a touchdown. So the objective measure at the end for the RP 7 or the RP 8 is just that you had 2 reps up from 10. If you have shit technique, that's a separate, distinct issue that doesn't necessarily, and shit technique is going to limit our ability to act. Like if we have really, really bad technique, we're going to have inaccurate ratings of RPE, but I can't tell a client that their perceived exertion is wrong. I can say from my perspective, I don't think that that's correct. And I think that we have shitty technique, but I'm not going to say that that wasn't an RP 7 or wasn't an RP 8 because that's their rating of perceived exertion. And so I think those are two issues that people seem to conflate a lot of the times. And a lot of that also comes down to, depending on where an athlete is, in beginner, intermediate, advanced, elite, from a classification perspective, like we develop the program in a different way, because if you have someone with a low degree of repeatability and they're doing high rep sets, no shit, all of the reps aren't going to look the same. So maybe we modify the training program to give them less reps per set. to give them a better chance at having a high degree of repeatability. And then once they've improved their technique and that motor pattern is a little bit more dialed in, then we can start to taper up the amount of reps over time. But, their rating of that event and how ugly that event looked are two related but different issues.
Have you had where clients are, maybe they're like trying to get to something that's like RPE 7 or RPE 8, and it's like first set, they're like, okay, that was a 7. They add, a little bit of weight so they can try to get to the 8. They're like, oh, that was also a 7. They add a little bit more weight again, and they're like, that one's 7. And so now they're 3 sets in all of these 7s, but now you're at like 20 pounds apart. And then, were they all RPE 7? Or were they like, what's going on there?
Okay. So, and this is where RPE becomes this like kind of hard to understand concept, right? So I have RPE 7, which is like, I'm not listening to music. I'm not hyped up at all. I'm not excited at all. And I'm going in and I'm lifting. I have RPE 7 where I'm listening to music. I have RPE 7 where I'm listening to music and sniffing ammonia. And then I have RPE 7 where I'm listening to music, sniffing ammonia, getting slapped in the back, and it's in the knee. There's probably going to be 150 pounds difference between those RPE 7s. That doesn't mean that those are wrong. It just means that based on your psychological state, that perception of effort is different. And so likely what will happen in people who are not so great at for determining what their RPE is, it's likely that a scale hasn't been calibrated and they don't actually know what RPE 7 feels like because they don't know what RPE 10 feels like. So it's actually kind of indicative that this person probably has never meaningfully pushed to failure on anything. And that is much more likely why they've listed 3 sets that are 20 pounds apart, all at RPE 7. It's like, because they've never taken anything to failure and they've never taken that exercise to failure. So they don't know what taking that exercise to failure feels like. So then they can't work backwards to figure out what RPE 7 feels like. They're just like, oh, that was kind of hard. That was kind of hard. That was hard. Like, that's what their RPE 7 is. It doesn't mean 3 reps left in the time.
Right. Do you think that people need to work up to that, like, I can't lift it or failure point, like, often? Or how often should someone do that if they've never done it before?
Mm-hmm. So in newer beginner trainees or general population clients that you have coming in, you need to get them to understand the capacity of like actually pushing to failure or straining in very safe, very externally stabilized exercises, right? Like reaching concentric failure on shit like leg extension and leg press and a machine chest press and like things that were like, you can be an idiot and still not get hurt. And then you populate that in, because here's the thing. When we're going to go like a newer trainee, most of their training for the first 6 to 9 months, all that mean lift stuff, like all of the meat and potatoes of the program, is probably done with pretty low RPE. It's probably all RPE 5 or RPE 6 because we're trying to ingrain that pattern well. And then what they're likely doing is moving meaningfully close to failure on their accessories that are more externally stabilized because there's a low chance that they'll hurt themselves. And then when that client graduates from beginner to intermediate, then you can start to meaningfully push to failure on these less externally stabilized exercises, maybe things like dumbbell press or maybe things like, close grip bench or whatever, because they're competent enough with those patterns that they're not hurt themselves by pushing to failure. But that's what I would say, like their perception of intensity on the main lift stuff as a beginner is inaccurate because they haven't pushed to failure, but it's also not really necessary because we want to run very basic, very slow linear progression with these people, adding 2 reps a week or adding 5 pounds a week. And they're not really going to be pushing on that main stuff until they've graduated to kind of an intermediate.
I've heard you say things like for bench press, like a strong upper back is required.
Mm-hmm.
When somebody hears that and they go to do upper back stuff, is it important, like the position that they're doing that in? Should it look a lot like their bench press, or how should they be trying to set up their upper back work? Does it matter so long as they're just kind of feeling it in that general region?
Yeah. So I think an easier way to explain it is going to be, what do we need from our upper back in the context of a bench, right? So what we need from our upper back in the context of a bench is shoulder blades pulled down as far as they can along the rib cage, and then shoulder blades, once they're pulled down, pull in along the rib cage, right? So, that's probably going to look like some low trap. That's probably going to look like some lat, and that's probably going to look like some rhomboid. So when we say upper back, what we're actually saying is like these three muscles kind of in concert. And when we're programming our accessories, we have to be able to, at some points in the ranges of motion of those upper back exercises, be hitting that same joint angle and position, right? Which is that kind of shoulder extended position with our shoulder blades together and our shoulder blades down as much as we can. And that's going to ensure that we know what that feels like when we go back to the actual bench press, right? And so when we say upper back work, yeah, it does matter a lot the way it looks, because a fucking face pull probably isn't going to get you to understand what that sensation feels like.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, yes, it does matter a lot. And we have to remember the joint positions that we're trying to train in the actual bench press, which is scaps down and then scaps together. And then at least in some of our accessories, it doesn't have to be all, we try to train those same ranges.
Would you say that there are exercises that are better than others? Like, since we're trying to understand what that feels like with a barbell, would it be better to do it with a barbell versus doing it with dumbbells, or whatever gets them into that position?
It's whatever's going to get them best into that position. And what we know about human beings is that they're typically asymmetrical. So when you have an implement like a barbell that doesn't allow for free movement of the hands, it also doesn't allow us to train that asymmetrical nature of the human being, right? And so for most people, most of the time, like dumbbells and cables are going to be a little bit, or dumbbells, cables, and machines are going to be a little bit more effective than a tool like a barbell when it comes to training those positions. And also when it comes to just training in general, like I would say from an accessory exercise perspective, we can view, most people most of the time are going to be better served by machines, some cables, and some dumbbells. And with their main lifts, like the heavy stuff, they're going to be better served by the barbells. Right tool for right job.
Okay. So how do you, with clients that are like maybe struggling with some of these positions, so like if it's like with their bench, they're maybe dumping a bit more into internal rotation, and then with their squat, maybe, similar thing at the shoulder, maybe that's the same issue presenting itself where they're having a hard time maintaining external rotation so that they can get some tension in their lats. Is there a certain way that you go about approaching that?
Yeah, so it's a lot of it is like how aware of where your bicep were you after the first time you got like a wicked bicep pump? You were like, yeah, I know what my bicep feels like.
Yeah.
I know what they need by pump. I know exactly where that muscle is. And if you asked me any day of the week, I can point to it and tell you. So when we're thinking about training these muscles for the first time, and when we're thinking about training these muscles in a way that person's going to remember, the pump is one of the easiest ways for us to remember. So that's like really gross high rep stuff, right? Like sets of 15, sets of 20, sets of 30, where they're like, by the end, they're like all of the muscles associated that you've asked me to use to put that shoulder blade into that position are now full of blood. I know where all of those muscles are on my back. Tomorrow, I'm going to wake up and be like, oh shit, because I can feel all those muscles on my back. And it's a really easy way to do it. So, like one of the things that I love to have people do is like, you just do a body weight inverted row, right? So feet up on a bench, living onto a ball on a rack, and then they just pull their shoulder blades down, and then they just row, even the same position that they would touch the bar in their bench press, to failure. And they're going to do, 3 or 4 sets to absolute failure. And then magically, the next morning, they're going to wake up and be super sore, and they're going to be like, I know what he means by shoulder blades together and down. And I know what muscles I have to use to get my shoulder blades together and down, because they're all very sore.
Do you have people when they're a bit more maybe beginner or potentially intermediate who kind of struggle with when you're saying shoulders back and down, like tucking the elbow in too close to their side, or like,
yeah, that's a very, very common presentation that we have. And a lot of that comes down to just like a lack of scapular awareness in general, right? So you're in Seattle, there's a ton of tech bros in Seattle. They all sit in front of computers all day and code, and they all have terrible posture, right? And so the greater the degree of kyphosis or upper back rounding someone has, probably the less chance that they're going to be able to understand where their shoulder blades are in space. So there's a degree of scapular awareness or positioning that we have to have before we can start to train these positions. So there's, from just an entering perspective, the first thing that you would want to do is get them into sufficient thoracic extension that they understand what a thoracically extended position feels like, right? And you're going to need to do some combination of mobility to get them into thoracic extension. And then the second thing that you need to do at that point is to get them to understand what it feels like to depress your shoulder blade. And you're going to get them to understand what it feels like to retract your shoulder blade. One of the best things that you can do for that is scapular cars, right? So controller articular rotations is like a tenet of FRC or functional range conditioning. Getting people to do quadruped scapular cars as part of the warm-up and having them move through elevation, depression, retraction, protraction after they've worked on their scapular or after they've worked on their thoracic mobility is going to then allow them to be like, oh, I get it. This is what it's supposed to feel like. This is where I'm supposed to put it. And then when you tell them, hey, you need to depress your shoulder blade, you know that they can get their shoulder blade into that position because they did it in their warm-up. And you know that they have the muscular capacity to do it because you saw it.
Yeah. When you first get people, or maybe somebody who's like more beginner, trying to do those quadruped, so like on all fours, scapular cars, do you see that they're more moving the rib cage around the scaps than they are moving the scaps around the rib cage?
Pretty much every time. And you know what? It's not even in general population or newer people. It's pretty much everyone. So what I typically tell people to do is I get them to sit back just a slight bit, and I get them to exhale and draw the rib cage down and back. And I'm like, okay, so we've sat under our haunches, we've exhaled with the rib cage down and back. We're going to walk our hands back now. Your rib cage has to stay in this exact same position. Your arms have to stay flexed. We can only articulate at that scapulothoracic joint. So
yeah,
we set them up and we give them a constraint in such a way that they're forced to move just at that joint. And then at first, they're going to be really shit at it. At first, they're going to have a hard time getting into some of those positions. And then the more reps they do, it's going to start to open up. It's going to start to open up. It's going to start to open up. And it's not necessarily that they're gaining additional ability through this. They're just developing that motor pattern.
Right. And so at first, because they don't have that motor pattern, a lot of people feel like, though I've heard people say things like, my body doesn't do that.
Yes. Yeah. And then, you can always be lighthearted about it, right? You can always be like, oh my God, you're a medical miracle. You're the only person in the world who's never been able to depress their shoulder blades. I'm going to call the university and they're going to do a study. And then they'll be like, oh, haha. It's like, everyone can do this. You're just bad at it.
Right. What, at first, when somebody's trying to go through that, if they feel like they're struggling more than average or anything like that, would you try to just find more positions to put them in that would expose them to that?
Yeah, that's a really great way to do it, right? It's like, okay, we're really shit at scapular mobility in our warm-ups and really don't understand that. What external constraints can we use? What additional things can we use in training to get them to understand that a little bit better? And honestly, it's going to be like making sure they're protracting fully on the rows, making sure that they understand when they protract that it's not just letting everything relax forward, it's actively pushing forward with our serratus, right? Making sure that like on all of their rows at the other end range, they're understanding to hold their shoulder blades together and not just hold their shoulder blades together, but hold them together and down to maybe mimic the positions that we would have on our bench. I don't know anyone, I've never coached anyone who's bad at scapular elevation. I think everyone can do that. But it's typically, these ranges of protraction, retraction, depression that they're really, really shit at. So making sure that they're getting there in their warm-up, making sure they're getting there in at least some of their training, and making sure that on non-training days, they're getting there at least once or twice is going to make sure that, after a couple of days, probably a week, they're going to be dramatically improved at getting into those positions just because they've been getting into those positions every day.
How important do you feel unilateral movements are for things like the squat and the deadlift?
So I have really kind of changed my tune or changed my opinion on this as things as I've kind of gotten older. So before I was like, well, ambulatory, we walk on one leg. It just makes sense that we would use unilateral exercise. And what I now kind of believe or understand is that if you are seeing a client who has some type of movement deficit or movement issue, then doing unilateral work to bring that up is going to be very effective. Outside of that inability, I keep some degree of unilateral lower body stuff into my squat and my deadlift, like maybe a couple of sets of walking lunges a week. So just so they're not like completely losing access to that ability or quality. But I don't place a high priority on it, a super high priority on it. And, in some of my more advanced trainees, like they might be doing 2 or 3 sets of unilateral exercises a week for the lower body. Like it's really not a lot of their training. In an actuality, like having done a ton of unilateral lower body stuff and not done a ton of unilateral lower body stuff, I've seen about the same results. And if we've taken care of their warm-up effectively and we're getting them to train the things that they're bad at, I've seen about the same results in terms of their pain.
So when it comes to like, if you fully pulled it out, do you feel like you're going to be able to maintain that same level of function once you've established good squat and deadlift patterns?
I would say probably not, right? Like there's probably some kind of baseline, whether it's in a warm-up or whether we're in actual kind of working sets, accessories after the main work, that has to be there, right? Like I do walking lunges and knees over toe stuff in like all of my warm-ups, right? Like I do single leg banding CKEs, like I do, I do walking lunges, I do knees over toes, walking lunges, I do front foot overhead split squats, I can do all that stuff in my warm-ups. So I'm training that quality. I'm not necessarily training that quality in like an output context, right? Like I'm not trying to go to failure on these or push super hard on them. It's just to make sure that I still have that ability, right? It's like, it's like 40-year-old virgin. Is it true if you don't use it, you lose it? When it comes to these more kind of like unilateral or gait specific stuff, like you do have to have some degree of it in your program. It doesn't necessarily have to be rising to the degree of like, I'm doing it as all of my loaded accessories after I squat or deadlift. It can be just in the warm up, and it can be just like on non-training days, right? There's no real rules with it. And what I would say is you either add it in or take it out based on a deficit or an issue that the person has. And a lot of people, like one client that comes to mind, when he came to me, like he's a little bit asymmetrical, but a lot of his asymmetry in his upper body was due to like asymmetry in thoracic rotation. And then once we cleaned up that asymmetry in thoracic rotation, a lot of his twisting or weird mechanics went away, and then his lower body was able to express evenly. And then because his lower body was able to express evenly, we meaningfully added to his squat and his deadlift by a lot. And he does like 2 sets of front foot overhead split squats a week, even though he was a pretty asymmetrical person. So it's not like I don't think it's an all or nothing thing. And I think a lot of people, because they don't really warm up, forget that you can just train these qualities in your warm up as well.
Gotcha. Is there, in terms of like, you're not looking for an absolutely meaningful stimulus from that unilateral work. You want it in there, but maybe just to kind of check the gauges, so to speak, like just see how things are moving. But if you saw somebody was maybe losing that quality, or they felt they were losing that quality for some particular reason, would you then make it more of a priority, or would you go back to seeing, is it more of this thoracic rotation or?
Yeah. So I think it's where there's smoke, there's fire, right? So, because you have to be able to parse through information that clients give you. And I know, because you work in Seattle and there's a certain cohort of people that you work with in Seattle where they've never really pushed hard on anything, and they don't understand what effort is, and they don't understand what to tell you that's like relevant information. But like, I feel my shoulder when I do that. And I'm like, you should. You're using your shoulder. You know the exact kind of person I'm talking. And when it comes to stuff like this, like if someone feels like they're losing the ball, because I have fielded that question or fielded that concern more times than I care to admit. And much more often, it's like you'll be like, well, I feel like I'm not as good at like unilateral stuff. It's like, okay, well, like, are we competing in powerlifting? And they're like, yes. And I'm like, okay. So are you in pain? No. Are your lifts going up? Yes. Does it matter that you're losing that quality? Well, I don't know. It's like, okay, so you're not in pain and your lifts are going up, and you're paying me to get your lifts up and get you out of pain. And I'm like, yes. And I was like, so maybe we've placed too much importance on this as a quality or a concept. And I think it's really, really crucial that like we have like an effective bullshit filter when it comes to the information that clients are telling us. Because yeah, like there is going to be a group of people who like, this happens very, very often in really, really high level, really, really developed squatters and deadlifters, that your hips lose relative joint range of motions as you get strong, right? Your hips are going to have way better hip mobility, 400-pound squat than they are at a 900-pound squat. And that's okay. And that's normal. And if we find that that person has lost so much hip mobility that they are in pain squatting to death, unilateral exercises could be an effective means of restoring that, but they are by no means a magic bullet. And I think their value is overstated by a lot of people.
Do you think that it would have more of a place in maybe more of an athletic endeavor that would take them through full gait cycle, like where they're like running, or if they're like having to change direction or something like that?
Massively. And I think that's where it comes down to the right tool for the right job. If you're getting someone just better at squatting, bench pressing, and deadlifting, a lot of their stuff should look like those joint positions. And if you're getting someone good at moving, there's a lot of things that go into moving. So there's going to be a lot more exercises that you do, and there's going to be a lot more movement options and joint angles that you're going to be in and train compared to a powerlifter. And I think a big mistake that a lot of people make is they look at sport training programs, like for actual sports, right? Because powerlifting was like kind of a sport. If they look at like actual sport training, for someone who's like running or someone who's playing football, and they're like, well, that, these guys do it, so we got to do it too. It's like, well, no, because they're actually trying to be athletic, and you don't need to be athletic. So maybe don't worry about it as much.
All right. That brings me to a post that I saw you make not too long ago, and I want to hear a little bit more about this. Like people who like to do powerlifting and then do like box jumps and then do like depth jumps or, whatever, the thing that they are like, okay, well, I'm doing this thing heavy, and if I do it fast, it's kind of like conjugate. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So like me, and I'm speaking on this from a perspective of someone who's tried pretty much everything there is to try in a powerlifting context, right? Like I've run pretty much every program there is to run. I've been coached in pretty much every style there is to be coached in. And I think it's the right tool for the right job. And it has to be context specific. And then it also has to be overlaid with this idea of specificity, right? And so we first have to remember that jumps, especially in people with a low degree of physical competency, are pretty fatiguing because you're super fucking bad. And I see something that a lot of people is that like, am I going to prescribe box jumps for most powerlifters? No, because they suck at moving. They're powerlifters, right? And it's like, what's probably going to carry over to the sport better and what's probably going to have that person be in less pain long-term would be like squatting fast, doing dynamic effort squats, because you're practicing the actual sport skill. You're still training that quality and speed, but it's in something that's going to directly one-to-one correlate to our actual competition patterns. So I think the value of this kind of stuff is overstated. And I think it's, there's some stuff that we can carry over from like sport-specific strength and conditioning to powerlifting, and I think it's beneficial. And I think a lot of that comes down to periodization. of just like understanding that we're going to bias certain qualities at certain times of the year, and then we're going to bias other qualities at other times of the year. But like depth jumps, box jumps, like, dude, most people suck at jumping. And the chance of most people who are general population people or normies, like doing a box jump and hurting themselves, like, you'd be surprised.
Yeah.
Right. They're going to skin their knee, or they're going to land on a hyperextended knee and they're going to bone their meniscus up.
Have you seen the one?
Good.
Have you seen the one where the lady goes to do the box jump and it like she lands?
Yeah.
And they show like the meat pack.
Yeah. Well, and it with shit like that, right? It's like, and I think, I have the ability to make that differentiation too, because like I did play actual sports at a high level. Right. And so for me, I'm like, I remember doing those sorts of things when I played football. I remember doing those sorts of things when I played rugby, but those were to train qualities that I didn't get through the barbell. Whereas like we have this ability in powerlifting to train that actual quality with the actual implement that we use in the sport. And so to me, not doing that, you have to then justify that, right? There has to be like a really, really good reason as to why you are doing that. And when you really start to ask those, we'll be like, hey, is there a reason why you're doing box jumps as opposed to dynamic effort squats? Most of the time, they can't actually give you an answer. And if they give you an answer, it's usually pretty poorly formed and poorly thought out. And you're like, okay, have you thought about like doing it this way? And they're like, well, no. Yeah. Like, okay. So maybe that's an issue, right? Is there is a certain thing that happens as a byproduct of social media, which is just like regurgitation, right? Is we see people do stuff and we're like, well, this person I look up to is doing this, so I'm going to do what this person I look up to is doing. And I realize that because there's also people who copy what I do, and I'll be like, well, why are you doing that? And they're like, well, because I saw you do it. I'm like, okay, but I'm doing it for this reason. What reason are you doing it for? And they're like, I don't know, because I saw you doing
it. How do you feel about something like velocity-based training?
So, I had this conversation actually this week with someone. I think there's a certain cohort of person or a certain type of person who really looks for metrics because they don't trust themselves.
Would they fall under that neurotic category?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. And so it's the kind of person, right? So they're going to be someone who's like, well, I need this velocity-based training because sometimes I don't accurately, pick my RPEs, and I couldn't possibly do percentages because I have too much of a variance on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis in terms of my performance. So I need to have this $400 Tendo unit attached to my bar so that that can tell me how hard it was, as opposed to just trusting your body and asking yourself after the set and looking at the footage, what do I think that was? Right. And it's like, because essentially like neurotic behavior is, I don't trust myself. You just need to tell me what's going on. You just need to tell me this. You just need to give me what I need. Right. Because it's essentially externalizing your anxiety and saying, I don't trust myself. I'm struggling with this. I need someone else to just tell me what to do because I don't trust or believe in what I'm telling myself.
Do you think there's a good way because I mean, the archetype of human that you've been describing this whole time, like the Seattle tech bro, also tends to be more like that.
Yes.
So do you feel like there is something that those people could do to help with that trait neuroticism, to like help bring that down a bit? Or do you think that's something that they're just kind of like stuck with?
I really don't, like, as someone who was neurotic for a long period of time in my own training, I do not think it's an unfixable trait. But I think much more commonly what happens is people don't see it as an issue, right? And so what I typically tell people is, if you are really just a like go by feel kind of guy, maybe tracking a little bit more metrics might give you more insight into your own training. If you are a very neurotic person, purposefully spending time tracking zero metrics may actually help, right? And so it's essentially whatever they have, just give them the output. So if they have this over-analytical, super critical brain saying, hey, you know what? You don't actually get any info. You just have to learn to trust yourself. And then for the people who are like, I don't know, I'm just going to go and lift, giving those people some metrics, you start to tell them like, okay, well, we have this and we have this, and these two metrics correlate to this, which is the outcome. So maybe if we look at these two, in addition to how we're feeling, we get a better understanding of how we respond to training and what trends are occurring. And you're like, okay, well, I can do that, right? Like you have to show the utility to those people. But what I would say for most people most of the time is like, they don't want to have to do the thinking for themselves, right? Like that's like, as bad as it sounds to say, like that's why continuing education exists. That's why university exists, right? It's like, it's also like I'm just off-putting and thinking to someone else, and I'm just being told what to do, and then I'm just going to do with that information as I please. And so people can do the same thing in their training, where they're just like, they don't trust themselves, but like those who compete at the highest level and those who are the best have this deep implicit trust in their own rating of perception or difficulty. And that's something that if you have a lifter who's relatively high level, but they're also relatively neurotic, if you can work to get them to trust themselves and to stop relying so much on metrics and to just go by feel, that person will then very quickly move to the next level.
Stu, this has been awesome. I know that this could go for a very long time just because you are an untapped wealth of knowledge.
Appreciate it.
So I'm gonna let you go right now, but I was wondering if there's best places for people to check you out. I know you mentioned Kodiak Barbell, but where else can people find you?
Yeah. So Instagram is pretty much the only social media I have. I have Facebook for like my family and friends. So Stu_KodiakBarbell.com if you want to check out the services that we have available to offer, or the bios for myself or any of the coaches that we have at Kodiak Barbell. KodiakBarbell.com is the best place to do that. If you want to send me an email about anything kind of work or business related, Stu@KodiakBarbell.com, and that's it.
I'll be sure to include as much of that as I can in the show notes as well. So be sure to check that out. If you guys like this episode, be sure to like it, share it with some people. There's lots of people that would benefit from hearing the things that came out of Stu's mouth today. So be sure to share it and write us a review. If you like this episode, let us know. So again, Stu, thanks for being on, and hopefully we get you on again in the future.
Hell yeah, dude.